We are now at the final stages of this beautiful journey of carbon and electrons that we call photosynthesis and cell respiration. If you couldn't tell, I love this stuff. And someday you might too. Looking at the electron transport chain, this is where we finish out the movement of electrons and completing the chemical reaction of cell respiration. Remember that in cell respiration, it is the reverse of photosynthesis. So we're going to take our C6H12O6, glucose, fructose, galactose, but glucose. We need to react it with oxygen. We have not actually seen oxygen take place yet, but because we're in the mitochondria, that means we are under aerobic conditions. This is where oxygen comes in. We already saw the release of all of our CO2 through the citric acid cycle in link reaction. And then we are going to finish out by forming water here in the electron transport chain. Remember that photosynthesis is just the reverse of this process, where we take these inorganics and make organic compounds. It's just so cool. All right, first step. Our high energy electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, are going to shuttle electrons from the citric acid cycle and link reaction to the electron transport chain. So they are going to come to the electron transport chain where it's a bunch of embedded proteins within the inner membrane of the mitochondria. These guys are shuttles. They're shuttling electrons, which means that they're going to drop these electrons off at these proteins. Those electrons are then going to move across to each successive protein. Each successive protein is more electronegative than the next, which means each successive protein wants the electrons more. And when they want electrons more, they're going to give off energy. So these electrons are jumping, they are moving, proteins want them, energy is released. So as electrons are being transferred, energy is being released. This energy allows protons, or positive hydrogens, to be shoved against gradient. So it's going from a low concentration in the matrix to a high concentration in the itty bitty little living space of the inner membrane space. That is not natural. We need energy to go against a gradient because naturally everything wants to diffuse until it's at equal concentration. So the energy from the movement of the electrons is what allows us to shove protons into this tiny space of the inner membrane space, and we form a gradient. Now we're going to come back to this gradient in just a minute, but we still have some electrons that are hanging out, and we need to know where these electrons go because we know we just don't chuck electrons. It's not what we do. They've got to go somewhere. What happens is that we have protons around and we have oxygen. Now I know I have 1/2 O2 here because we can't just have a single oxygen. So I'm saying I have half of an oxygen molecule. Really, we've got like 4 hydrogens and we've got like 1 oxygen molecule and lots of things are going on, but I don't want to worry about balancing chemical reactions and all that stuff. So just write it down. What occurs is oxygen's the most electronegative species in this process, which means it wants the electrons the most. So as these electrons are moving through these proteins and shuttling protons against gradient into the inner membrane space, oxygen's like, ha ha, come to me. Very dramatic. And so oxygen is the final electron acceptor, which allows oxygen then to attract 2 protons to make water. So oxygen is the final electron acceptor, and this is where our water is made. Now we're done with a chemical reaction, except the ATP part, because we need to make our energy. Again, that's why we have to eat. All right, so our electrons are taken care of, but now we shoved a bunch of positive protons into this little tiny space, and we know positive doesn't like positive, so they want to get out of there. So this is where we get the formation of our ATP. So the protons are going to diffuse back through what's called the ATP synthase. So it's an embedded enzyme in the membrane. It's a two-part enzyme, which is why it kind of looks like a squid octopus thing, but this is the coolest enzyme in the world. So 2 parts, and the holes need to line up in order for the proton to drop through. So if I'm the inner membrane space and then the matrix. So the proton's going to go into that first part of the enzyme. That's going to create a spinning action of both parts or both subunits of this enzyme. That spinning action creates that tunnel to drop the proton through. That mechanical energy is what allows a phosphate to form a bond onto ADP. So we're using mechanical energy to make chemical energy. It is so cool, but that's like how generators work too. Same kind of concepts, is that mechanical energy is what will shoot electrons to make electricity. But it's so cool. So here we make ATP. On average, per glucose, we get 34 to 36 ATP being produced in this process. I'm not going to test you on that. But just to give you an idea that 6 carbons ultimately give us a surplus of this energy through this entire process. In summary, for the most beautiful process in the world, we had started with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis took inorganic carbon dioxide and water, and through a series of reactions formed our organic carbon compounds, whether we're talking carbohydrates, proteins, or lipids, and oxygen. Great, we made oxygen. More importantly, we made organic compounds. Then we decide to eat some of those organic compounds and take those compounds through digestion. We then absorb those monomers into our cells, and they're going to go through their catabolic processes. So in particular with our carbohydrates, we're going to go through glycolysis. Glycolysis is going to give us that pyruvate that allows it to then get shuttled into the mitochondria to go through the citric acid cycle. That is where our inorganic CO2 gets re-released. We exhale it out for plants to take it back in and do it all over. And then those high energy electron carriers, all those electrons that happened when we released that CO2, goes to the electron transport chain where we get our water, which we can use in our body and or expel via our breath and other processes, and our energy so that our body can run and function as it is. The coolest process ever.